At 10:23 a.m. on the 6th of May, 1957, a large man in a cheap suit climbed the worn stone steps of the United States Embassy on Avenue Gabriel in Paris. His tie was pulled tight but crooked. His eyes were bloodshot from a 12-day drunk. In the pocket of his jacket, there were two objects that did not belong together: a hollow coin packed with microscopic code and $5,000 in cash that did not belong to him. He paused just before the glass door, as if considering the alternative: the airport, the Aeroflot flight, the slow conveyor belt toward Moscow, and whatever waited there. Then he pushed the door open and stepped inside. On the embassy log, he would be recorded without ceremony. Male, approximately 35 to 40, foreign accent, claims to be Soviet intelligence. In the archives of the KGB, his name already existed on thin gray paper: Reino Häyhänen. In the American case files, he would later become the drunk KGB Courier, the man whose fear and incompetence accidentally handed the FBI one of the biggest counterintelligence victories of the early Cold War. In this story, he will simply be Reo. Within a few months, his drunken walk into the embassy would lead to the arrest of the KGB's master illegal resident in the United States, known to Moscow as William Fisher and to the world as Rudolf Abel. It would solve a 4-year-old FBI mystery about a hollow nickel found in Brooklyn. It would feed textbooks, training manuals, and eventually Hollywood scripts. For Reo himself, it would end in a different place: a small hospital in Pennsylvania, a liver destroyed by alcohol, a grave under a false name where no one came to visit. The system he had served would pretend he had never lived. The system he had betrayed would protect him until he drank himself into the ground. The price of survival, in this case, was anonymity. In the years after the Second World War, the world split along a visible crack line. On one side stood the United States, industrial giant, newly armed with nuclear weapons, projecting its influence through bases, dollars, and radio waves. On the other side stood the Soviet Union, devastated in human terms, but victorious and convinced that history was finally on its side. Between them, almost everything became a battlefield: newspapers, trade unions, student movements, scientific conferences, even families listening at night to the wrong station on the radio. Intelligence work, once a shadowy tool of empires, became a central weapon. The Americans built their new instruments first: the Central Intelligence Agency, then the National Security Agency, on top of wartime experience. The Soviets evolved their own, more quietly, through renamings and purges, from NKVD to MGB, then to KGB. In Moscow, inside an office that smelled of stale tobacco and cheap cologne, someone signed the order that would change Reo's life. He was selected for the line that mattered most: illegal work abroad. Illegal officers were not spies in the cinematic sense. They were bureaucrats and technicians who disappeared inside fabricated lives. They carried no diplomatic passports, enjoyed no immunity. If they were caught, their governments would deny knowing them. Among Soviet officers, it was both an honor and a sentence. Reo's file made him look suitable. He was born in 1920 near Leningrad, to Finnish parents who had moved east across the border in search of work and a future that did not exist for them in the West. He had grown up bilingual. During the war, that made him useful for interrogating prisoners, reading captured documents, infiltrating Finnish circles. The war ended. Many men like him were demobilized, sent back to factories, farms, and reconstructed apartment blocks. He stayed. The secret police liked people who stayed. His personnel evaluations described him in short, cold phrases: politically reliable, obedient, not intellectually outstanding, but persistent, strong language skills in Finnish and some English, shows tendency to drink to excess, requires supervision. That line, "requires supervision," was underlined in red pencil. it would remain there like a hairline crack under a concrete bridge. In the Soviet Union of the late 1942s, a man in his position lived in a small communal apartment, perhaps 2 rooms shared with another family, walls thin enough to hear arguments and coughs. He stood in line for bread and meat. He watched films about enemies encircling the motherland. He understood, without anyone explicitly telling him, that his fate depended entirely on the system whose slogans were painted above the factory gates. Some of his colleagues disappeared after closed-door investigations. Sometimes their names were not spoken again. In a culture built on fear, people did not inquire about the missing. When the offer came to train for illegal work abroad, with a cover identity, better food, travel, and a different kind of danger, he accepted. Declining was theoretically possible. In practice, it was noticed. The training took place over several years. First came languages. His Finnish was polished, his English was sharpened to something that would pass in New York or Seattle as odd but not suspicious. In rooms with heavy curtains and taped windows, they drilled him in American idioms, taught him to say apartment instead of flat, to ask for gas instead of petrol, to pronounce the letter R from the back of the mouth. Then there was the legend, the full artificial life he would inhabit. The Soviet services, by then, had perfected a method for creating such ghosts. They did not invent people from nothing, they stole them. Somewhere in the United States, there had been a real Eugene Nikolai Mecki, the son of Finnish immigrants. He had returned to the Soviet Union in the 1932, attracted by promises of a worker's paradise. He, like many others, had run into the machinery of suspicion and been ground to dust in prisons or camps. His American birth certificate, however, remained. Using that piece of paper, and a trail of fabricated documents built on top of it, Moscow's specialists constructed Rayo's new skin. He would become Eugene N. Marquis again, this time traveling in the other direction back to America, carrying orders in his head and codes in his pocket instead of naive dreams. They trained him in tradecraft, how to recognize surveillance in a crowd, how to conduct a dead drop without turning his head, how to open and reseal envelopes, how to photograph documents with a miniature camera in a broom closet. They taught him the mechanical skill of building hollow objects, screws drilled out from the back, coins sliced into thin shells, razor blades with cavities that could swallow a strip of microfilm. They also taught him to live a double life, to drink with his neighbors without saying anything, to be charming but forgettable. What they could not remove was the part of him that reached for a bottle whenever fear, boredom, or loneliness grew too large. It stayed with him, like the accent that never quite left his English. He arrived in New York in 1952 with his new wife herself involved in the operation, or at least aware enough of it to know that their future depended on silence. They had crossed the Atlantic on the Queen Mary, surrounded by tourists who took photographs of the Statue of Liberty as the ship glided into harbor. The immigration officer at the port inspected his passport, saw the place of birth, somewhere in Minnesota or Washington, depending on which version of the legend he carried that day, and stamped him in. As far as the United States government was concerned, Eugene Marquis had simply come home. They rented a small house in Peekskill, a town north of New York City, with tree-lined streets, porch steps, and neighbors who watched out their windows. To the people next door, they were an odd couple with foreign manners, but nothing more. A man who said he worked in translation, a wife who sometimes drank too much and shouted in a language no one understood. By day, he tried to live the life that the legend demanded. He dealt with landlords, utility companies, tax forms. He learned where to buy food cheaply, how to talk to store clerks without sounding aggressive or hesitant. By night, he became the instrument Moscow had sent him to be. On some evenings, he sat in his car, parked in the dark near a bridge, watching reflections on the river to check if someone was sitting behind him with headlights off. On others, he walked through the city, past neon signs and diners, counting his steps. At a particular lamppost, he would pause and tie his shoe, leaving or collecting a package taped out of sight. On a park bench, he adjusted his hat, sliding a matchbox into the gap between two boards. Under a loose brick in a retaining wall, he concealed a microfilm that had traveled across continents. He did not handle secrets directly from the heart of the American state. He was a courier, a connector, the middle segment of a chain that led from Soviet handlers to sources inside Western institutions. His job was to make sure the chain remained unbroken, invisible. Somewhere in Brooklyn, another Soviet officer worked as the hub of this network. That man called himself an artist. He rented a studio in a building full of painters, sculptors, and small-time commercial photographers. His hair was thinning, his suits were cheap. He walked with the slight stoop of a middle-aged man who had learned not to attract attention. His real name was William Fisher, a veteran of Soviet intelligence since the 1922nd. To his neighbors, if they noticed him at all, he was just another struggling immigrant with a camera. In the dossiers, he was one of the most valuable illegals Moscow had ever placed on American soil. Rayo knew him only by code name and by the rhythm of their meetings, carefully staged to minimize what either man knew about the other. Compartmentalization was the rule. No one person should understand the full picture. Yet even the most carefully constructed systems depend, in the end, on the fallibility of the people who inhabit them. One of the earliest cracks appeared in something as small as a coin. Soon after arriving, Rayo was meant to receive detailed instructions and reassurance from Moscow, transmitted in the form of a microfilm packed into a hollowed-out nickel. The coin had been prepared with surgical precision, sliced into halves, thinned, reassembled with a cavity inside, then machined so perfectly that only a trained eye could spot the seam. The plan was simple. A contact would pass him the nickel in an innocuous transaction. He would pocket it, go home, slice it open, read the coded message, and then dispose of the evidence. Reality diverged. In the thick of a New York day, noisy, crowded, full of small transactions, he mixed the special coin with the rest in his pocket. Perhaps he was distracted by surveillance. Perhaps he was already carrying the dull ache of a hangover. Perhaps he simply behaved like any ordinary man who does not obsess over every coin he spends. A few hours later, a boy delivering newspapers received the nickel as part of his tip. Back home, the boy dropped the coin, heard a strange sound, and later noticed that it had split. Inside, his guardians found the microfilm and, recognizing something unusual, eventually turned it over to the authorities. The Federal Bureau of Investigation took possession of the tiny strip of film some months later. Technicians peered at rows of 5-digit numbers they could not decode. The laboratory confirmed that the symbols corresponded to some kind of cipher text, but there was no key and no context. They did not know who had sent it, who was meant to receive it, or what it said. Within the FBI, it became known simply as the hollow nickel case. It sat in safes and on desks as a nagging reminder that somewhere in New York, someone was running a sophisticated operation they could not see. Rayo, unaware of the chain he had set in motion, continued his routines. He filed reports, he received instructions, he drank. The second crack came in the form of $5,000. In Moscow, some officer decided that a widow deserved money. The name Morton Sobel had already appeared in American newspapers, associated with Julius and Ethel Rosenberg and their espionage activities. His wife was living in difficult circumstances. The Soviet state, which officially disavowed such work, sometimes made small gestures toward those who had served it. $5,000 was a considerable sum in the mid-1950s, especially when transmitted in cash. The money was to be delivered discreetly, through the chain of illegals in the United States, to a woman who knew too much to stand in line at any embassy. William Fisher was given the responsibility for the operation. He, in turn, involved his courier. In a wooded area of Bear Mountain State Park, north of New York City, a package was buried, $5,000, wrapped against moisture, waiting to be retrieved and passed along. On paper, the plan was clean. The terrain offered cover, the dead drop minimized contact, the money would go from Soviet hands to Soviet hands without ever touching a bank. In practice, one weak link controlled the process. Reyo went into the woods, dug up the money, and did not deliver it as instructed. He reported to Moscow that the mission had been completed. He told Fisher the same. Instead of handing the cash over, he took it with him. Some of it paid for a new rental in New Jersey. Some of it dissolved into alcohol. Some of it simply vanished into the unfocused finances of a man who had never controlled such sums before. He lied competently enough for a time. Soviet intelligence systems were paranoid about enemies, but sometimes naive about simple human weakness. Reports went back to Moscow, describing a success that had not taken place. Yet performance could not be falsified forever. The pattern of his work spoke for itself. Missed opportunities, unexplained absences, sloppiness in communication. His wife's erratic behavior, including an incident where she stabbed him in the leg during a drunken argument, did little to reassure his superiors. The complaints accumulated. At a certain point, someone in Moscow underlined a sentence in his file again and added another. Recall to center recommended. In the language of the KGB, recall was not a neutral administrative term. It meant that an officer's fate would be reconsidered in the place where decisions were final. Those who returned from long postings abroad sometimes received promotions. Others sat in interrogation rooms under bright lights, while colleagues asked them questions about their loyalties, their contacts, their mistakes. A few emerged. Many disappeared into the penal geography of the Soviet state. Transit prisons, labor camps, unmarked graves along logging roads. Reyo understood this. He had interrogated others. He had returned from operations and heard that men he knew were no longer with the service, spoken in a tone that meant precisely what it implied. When the order came for him to leave the United States and travel back to Moscow, he did not hear a change of posting. He heard a verdict not yet spoken aloud. He left New York in the spring of 1957, not by commercial airliner, but on a ship across the Atlantic. The authorities preferred that route for officers whose names and faces they wished to keep away from passenger manifests and visa lists. The ship, a liner making its regular run from New York to Europe, carried families on holiday, businessmen, and a man who drank through most of the 10-day voyage. There was time, above the gray water, to consider possibilities. A loyal officer could frame the recall as an opportunity, perhaps a temporary setback, perhaps a new assignment in another country. A man who had lied about $5,000 and lost a hollow coin might calculate differently. By the time he disembarked in Le Havre and continued onward to Paris, the decision had already formed inside him, though he would not admit it yet. He checked into a hotel arranged by Soviet channels. His onward ticket by air this time was booked for the 6th of May, back toward Moscow. Between his arrival and that date, there stretched 12 days. He did not spend them sightseeing. The bar in the hotel became familiar with his face. He drank in the afternoons, the evenings, the late nights. He spoke little to other guests. He wrote no letters home that survived. His world narrowed to the interior of his own fear, dulled by alcohol. At some point during those days, he found the courage or desperation to pick up the telephone and call the United States Embassy. Later, American records would note that a man with a heavy accent had contacted them, claiming to have information about Soviet espionage. By the time anyone was prepared to take the call seriously, the line had gone dead. The embassy was a short walk from the hotel. The airport was a longer journey by car. The date of his flight approached like an hour hand that refused to stop. On the morning of the 6th, instead of traveling toward the aircraft that would carry him into the hands of his own security service. He put on his suit, checked that the envelope with the money was still in his pocket, and headed for the embassy. The decision, when it came, was not heroic. It was the choice of a man who knew what his own side would likely do to him, and hoped that the other side would value him enough to keep him alive. The $5,000 were not a gesture of goodwill. They were stolen property, a symbol of his failure as much as of Soviet generosity. He carried them like an insurance policy. He also carried another hollow coin, this time a Finnish 50-mark piece, prepared by Moscow for communications and never used. It rattled softly against the lining of his pocket as he climbed the embassy steps. Inside, the Marines at the door, the guards behind glass, saw what stood before them, an overweight, disheveled man who smelled of liquor and claimed to be a colonel in the KGB. They had no reason to believe him. In the first hours, the Americans treated him not as a prize, but as a problem. During the early Cold War, both sides occasionally sent fabricated defectors, people who claimed to have switched allegiance, but were in fact under orders to spread disinformation or to identify weaknesses inside the receiving service. The possibility that Reino was such a plant could not be dismissed. He told them he had served as a courier in the Soviet intelligence system. He described his work with dead drops, his contact with a higher-level illegal officer in New York. He explained, in clumsy but intelligible English, that returning to Moscow would likely mean his death. There is a bureaucratic rhythm even to moments like these. Embassy staff called Washington, CIA officers flew in or sent cables. Somewhere in the chain of communication, a decision was made to test his story rather than send him away. The tests were simple at first. They asked for details only someone with inside knowledge could know: names, code words, techniques. He provided enough to keep them listening, but not enough to erase doubt. The balance shifted when he produced the hollow coin. American technicians, suspicious by training, took the Finnish coin and examined it. When they cracked it open and found microfilm inside, coded in the same style as the mysterious strip recovered years earlier from the hollow nickel in Brooklyn, the case changed shape. The man in the embassy was either A, an extraordinarily sophisticated liar with access to authentic Soviet materials, or B, exactly what he claimed to be. Caution remained, but curiosity grew. Within days, he was moved from Paris to a secure location and placed in the hands of interrogators who were not wearing embassy badges, but the more discreet labels of the Central Intelligence Agency and the FBI. The Americans used a word for the process that followed: debriefing. In practice, it meant long hours in anonymous rooms, the same questions repeated from different angles, the slow unspooling of a life. They wanted to know everything: his recruitment, training, missions, contacts, the structure of the KGB as he understood it, the habits and routines of his superiors. They wanted names, places, dates. They wanted defects, resentments, the tiny dislikes that accumulate in any organization. He answered, sometimes eagerly, sometimes grudgingly. He was not a man of firm ideological convictions. He did not present his defection as a protest against communism or a conversion to democracy. He framed it, when asked, in terms of survival. Moscow, he believed, would kill him. Washington, he hoped, would not. The Americans understood the value and limitations of such a source. They knew that a man who had lied to his own side, stolen from them, and drunk through his duties would not magically become honest in a new uniform. So, they set his claims against facts they could verify and against one another. When details overlapped and reinforced each other, they took note. When they diverged, they returned with sharper questions. Eventually, they focused on the figure at the center of his operational life in the United States, the illegal resident he had known only by a cover name and a handful of personal impressions. He described a man older than himself, speaking English with a trace of a British accent, living among artists in Brooklyn, using the profession of painter and photographer as density around his secret work. He described the way the man walked, dressed, the care with which he maintained his anonymity. He could not give an address. Tradecraft had seen to that. He had only directions, landmarks, the memory of staircases and corridors visited on rare occasions when their paths had crossed directly. The FBI took those fragments and did the kind of work they knew best: methodical investigation. They mapped the clues onto the geography of New York. They narrowed down the possibilities: buildings that matched, neighborhoods where a foreign artist with limited income and many cameras might have lived. They cross-checked with immigration records, landlord statements, and anything else they could reach without triggering alarm. Eventually, their search led them to a building called Ovington Studios in Brooklyn. There, on a list of tenants, they found a name that did not ring any immediate bell: Emil R. Goldfuss. He was, according to the paperwork, a photographer. Surveillance teams observed him. They took photographs. They noted his routines, his visitors, his odd habits. The more they watched, the less he resembled an ordinary commercial photographer, and the more he matched the composite sketch formed from Rayo's testimony. The hollow nickel case, unsolved for years, now had a human shape. The arrest, when it came, was precise. In June 1957, agents followed the suspect to the Hotel Latham in Manhattan. They knew the room number. They knew his face. They had enough to justify an operation. At a calculated moment early morning, when the human mind is least prepared, they knocked on the door of room 839 and called him not by the name on the register, but by a military rank from his true life: Colonel. He hesitated, opened the door, and faced men who knew far more about him than he had thought possible. In the search that followed, they found what any counterintelligence officer hopes to find in such a room: evidence. Not just a camera and some tourist photographs, but the tools of a professional illegal. Hollowed artifacts, cipher pads, microfilm, radio components, coded notes. He gave his name as Rudolf Ivanovich Abel, borrowing the identity of a long-dead comrade in a final act of loyalty or habit. Later, historians would continue to use that adopted name for simplicity, cementing it into public memory. Behind the scenes, the FBI and CIA matched the materials from his room to the strip of microfilm from the hollow nickel and to the codes in the coin that Rayo had brought. The web closed. The trial, held in Brooklyn later that year, was conducted in a courtroom where spectators could see only the surface: a quiet, middle-aged man in a suit, accused of criminal conspiracy, defended by a lawyer named James B. Donovan, who took the case because someone had to, and because the American legal system demanded representation even for those labeled as enemies. In the background, Rayo played his assigned role again: courier of information, this time between his former masters and their adversaries. He took the stand as a key witness for the prosecution. The jurors saw a man who did not fit the romantic image of a spy. He was overweight, his face puffy from alcohol. His accent made his sentences heavy. Under cross-examination, he admitted to drinking to excess, to lying to his superiors, to stealing $5,000 he had been told to deliver. In any other kind of trial, such admissions would have destroyed his credibility. Donovan used them precisely for that purpose, suggesting that a man like this could not be relied upon to tell the truth about his colleague. But the documentary record: the coins, the codes, the seized equipment did not depend entirely on his word. His testimony stitched the pieces together, but did not create them from nothing. The jury, presented with both the physical evidence and this living embodiment of Soviet dysfunction, found Abel guilty on multiple counts of conspiring to commit espionage. The judge could have imposed the death penalty. He chose not to. Minutes spoken in that courtroom would later be cited in intelligence circles. Donovan argued that an officer like Abel might one day be useful in a prisoner exchange if an American fell into Soviet hands. Killing him would remove a bargaining chip. 5 years later, on a bridge between East and West Germany, that logic would prove correct when Abel was traded for a downed U-2 pilot named Francis Gary Powers. Reino, by then, was far from that bridge. After the trial, the United States government faced the question of what to do with the man whose drunken courage had made it all possible. They had no illusions about his character. He was not invited to give patriotic speeches. He did not appear on television as a symbol of freedom. He was, instead, quietly absorbed into the machinery designed to deal with people like him, the Witness Protection Program. Under a new name, John Eugene Linden. Among others, he and his wife were resettled in small American towns where no one knew their history. A modest house might be rented in New Hampshire or Pennsylvania. The neighbors would see a middle-aged couple with foreign manners and assume they were simply immigrants chasing a quieter life. Government cars with Washington plates would arrive occasionally, drawing curtains but not too much attention. His drinking did not stop. The problem that had undermined him in Soviet service did not evaporate with a new passport. Without the discipline of an organization, he had even fewer reasons to restrain himself. Police records from the early 1962 show at least one arrest for driving while intoxicated. Hospital records, some sealed, record treatments for liver problems. In August 1961, in a hospital in York, Pennsylvania, his body finally gave out. He was 41 years old. The death certificate carried the name he had been given in protection, not the one on his original Soviet file. The cause of death was clinical cirrhosis, complications of alcohol abuse. There was no mention that the dead man had once been a link in one of the most secret chains of Soviet intelligence. He was buried under a simple marker in a small cemetery. No delegation came from any embassy. No organization claimed him. The country he had served considered him a traitor. The country he had betrayed considered him a source, now exhausted. Above his bones, grass grew. In Washington, the hollow nickel was eventually placed in a display case devoted to notable counterintelligence cases. Visitors walking past could read a caption about ingenuity and persistence, about the cleverness of FBI investigation. The coin, which had once been a tool of Soviet clandestine communication, became an American exhibit. Reino himself remained mostly absent from public memory, blurred into the background of the story. Looking back on this case from the vantage point of later decades, intelligence professionals and historians often draw neat lines through its chaos. They point to the technical lessons. The Soviet services, they say, learned that even the most elaborate legends could be undone by human frailty. Background checks and psychological evaluations became stricter not just for ideological loyalty, but for signs of addiction and instability. They note the institutional lessons on the American side. The FBI, prodded by J. Edgar Hoover's obsession with communist infiltration, invested more heavily in cryptanalysis, surveillance, and patient analysis. The hollow nickel case, once a frustration, became a textbook example of how stray anomalies could be connected to larger patterns. Those are accurate conclusions, but they miss something quieter. At the center of this story are two men who embodied opposite poles of the same system. William Fisher Rudolf Abel in the courtroom represented discipline. He spent years in hostile territory, maintaining a cover identity, sending information, and saying very little. When captured, he did not attempt to bargain with his interrogators about his superiors. He accepted a long sentence in an American prison with the stoicism of someone who understood himself as a piece on a larger board. Reino represented weakness. He lied, drank, mishandled operations. When faced with the likelihood of his own execution, he chose self-preservation over loyalty and delivered his colleague to the enemy. He did so not out of conviction, but out of fear. The Soviet system relied on both types. It needed the obedient and competent, but it also depended on those who obeyed out of fear, who suppressed their doubts until they were forced to choose between death and betrayal. The American system, confronting them, behaved according to its own logic. It prosecuted one, publicized the victory, and used him in an eventual exchange. It shielded the other, not out of love, but out of calculation. A source is protected as long as he might be useful, then left to his own devices. In the end, what remained, tangibly, were two objects: a hollow coin in a museum and a grave with the wrong name. Behind them lay the life of a man who had never been particularly heroic, gifted, or evil. He had been, above all, ordinary, and it was that ordinariness dropped into the machinery of an extraordinary conflict that produced the outcome. The Cold War, in official narratives, is often described as a clash of ideologies, strategies, and grand designs. Cases like Rio's remind us that it was also a chain of small, personal choices. The decision to drink instead of staying alert, the lie told to a superior, the panic on a ship crossing the Atlantic, the moment of turning left toward an embassy instead of right toward an airport. In a system built on fear, silence, and the expectation of unquestioning loyalty, a single frightened courier could cause more damage than a dozen ideological enemies. The Soviet state tried to control everything except the unspectacular human failures it considered beneath its notice. For that oversight, it paid with networks exposed, officers arrested, and secrets laid bare on the desks of its adversaries. Rio paid with something different, a life reduced to a footnote, a story told mainly in training rooms and case studies, a name divorced from his own gravestone. When we trace his path from the Soviet countryside to Lubyanka's corridors, from a house in Peekskill to the steps of an embassy in Paris, we see not just a spy story, but a portrait of what happens when ordinary people are dragged into systems that ask them to trade everything, including their conscience and their survival instinct, for abstract causes. In the end, he chose survival. The system he betrayed moved on without him. The system he fled to filed his case, then closed it. The hollow nickels and hollow men of that era have mostly vanished. What remains in stories like this is a reminder that the real cost of totalizing systems is often paid not in grand gestures, but in quiet, desperate steps up an embassy staircase.